Jack Davison, my pitch. I'm going to get right into it. My project for Dream and Nightmares in the FNP, I've just got the working title, I've called it Dream of Dreaming. And essentially, the concept for my project is that it's going to be a short film that can be available on my website and can also be found on my YouTube channel. And the basic premise is that our protagonist is going to wake up in bed at home and everything's going to seem normal except they see a tape recorder at the foot of their bed. So they listen to it and there's a voice on the tape recorder and it says, "You're not going to understand this right now, but right now you're dreaming." And I understand that's confusing, but trust me when I say you need to travel through your dreams until you find the one where you wake up. So the entirety of this short film is going to be our protagonist travelling through these different dreams and being put in different scenarios, hoping to find the dream where they wake up. And a bit of a spoiler for the end of it, but they're not actually going to find the way out unless we don't see it, because it's going to end a bit ambiguous with them travelling to another dream and then the screen's going to cut out. Now, the reason I chose this rough idea is because while I was thinking about it over the holiday, I thought it can represent how life in general seems to have a bit of a lack of direction. We don't seem to have any general control over it. We're just thrust into new situations and are basically told, deal with it. So I kept that in mind to put our protagonists in these situations. Now, the target audience for this project, when researching into it, I found that students tend to watch short films more than any other people. And I believe that's usually because students are usually looking for inspiration for their own work, so they tend to go online to find these short films. So using that information in mind, I looked up the standard student and found that the average class is middle, and the age can range from just above and just below 21. For this specific project, the gender would be male, purely because it's going to have a male lead. If it was female lead, then obviously it would be female, because everyone gets affected by dreams. The ethnicity I found would be Caucasian English, because it's an English-speaking short film, and it obviously, if you don't speak English, you're not going to understand it. And I found that the average income for these students is around £14,370 per academic year. Now, as for the roles, I'm going to be taking the role of editor. That's my core focus, though depending on who I'm able to cast to assist me with this, I may also end up filming or acting in it, depending on the availability of who I'm asking to help me. Now, when it comes to my main influences for this, I had two major ones. The first one being a short film company based out of Los Angeles called Corridor Digital. And essentially, Corridor Digital is a warehouse based out of the outside of LA, and all they do is make short films for a living. Now, what I noticed that's kind of different about Corridor is they almost never develop their characters. It's always about the situation they're put in, not the character. So, for example, they have one where it's called Chopsticks Can Pick Up Anything. It's about a man who reads the packaging on the back of a pair of chopsticks, and it says that once you hold it a certain way, you can pick up anything. So it's about the protagonist being able to pick up buildings, cars, people with a pair of chopsticks instead of developing the character. The character's not even named, which is why in my one, I've decided not to name the protagonist because I don't feel it's necessary. It's more about the situation they're in. Now, that covers more of my narrative angle, but when it came to the actual editing angle, ironically, I thought that Monsters, Inc. was the biggest influence because of the chase sequence through the different doors. Because the way I want our protagonist to transition through different dreams is by going through small portals that they find around the world. But the difference is, these portals can be anywhere. They could be a door frame, they could be a wardrobe you have to climb into, it could be a cardboard box you have to jump into. So I can trim down the chase, oh, hang on, not yet, there you go. So I'll have that playing. Notice they always enter and exit the same direction, because this is why it doesn't stay confusing for the audience. They exit on the right hand side and enter on the left hand side. So I thought if I can replace the portals with doors, so instead of travelling between different places physically, it can be different dreams in their head. So that's a basic idea of how it's going to look visually. I've not quite decided on what these portals are going to look like, but I quite like the idea of a white glow shining out of these portals. Now, I did test it early on to see if this idea would actually work. And I found that front on very easy to do, and that's probably what I ended up using. But when it came to the side angle, it was nigh impossible due to the moving camera and also just the angle. So I've decided to get around this. I'm going to be using actual lights on set in order to cast light onto the actors to make it seem as if the doors are glowing. Now, as for the experiments I'm going to be doing, the first one I'm going to be doing is colour grading, because I've decided that each dream should be defined by a different colour palette. So the three I'm planning on going with are fear, confusion and joy. Now the way I plan on doing this is that when everything first starts is going to be confusion, and I've found that using colour wheels and colour association, purples and blacks and blues tend to connote, a sense of confusion, directionlessness and hopelessness. So I plan on doing that, but also adding a bit more of a blur onto it so everything's slightly out of focus, so even the viewer can't quite see what's happening. Then for joy, I've found that it's always yellows and sometimes blues, light blues, put together in order to liven up the atmosphere. And it also makes the skin colours on the actors pop while distinguishing them from the background. And finally, for fear, it's all about greens and browns and blacks. So that will make the whole shot a bit more muddy and a bit more dark and eerie. So I plan on doing that for scenes where they step more into nightmares than regular dreams. For example, I plan on having the protagonist being chased by someone wielding a knife. Obviously, there will be no explanation for this because they've been thrust into the situation and are now just looking for a way out. Now, the second technique I'm doing is just cloning technique, which basically means taking the same actor but making two of them appear in the same shot. So there's three ways I've thought about doing this. So first of all, I've thought of layering the shots, which means I film the same shot twice but with the actor in two different positions. I then cut one in half and lay that over the one that's complete, so that it looks like there's two actors. The second technique would be green screen, where I film the shot once with the actor in it as normal, but then I film a second one with a green screen with the actor in it, so I can then manually put the actor in a second time. And finally, there's the one where it's basically you get identical twins to do the shot, so it's all entirely real. Now the benefit of that one is that the two are actually able to interact with each other, because with all the other ones, because the clone of the person isn't actually real, they can't physically interact, otherwise they just phase through each other and it would look awful. Now the reason I'm doing this cloning technique is because at the end of this short film, I plan on the protagonist entering the same dream where they started and they can see themselves in bed before they wake up. And this is where the tape recorder comes in, because it's going to be our protagonist that leaves the tape recording for themselves. And that's the person who's the voice on the tape recorder that guides our protagonist at the beginning. And then finally, for my final experiment, I plan on replacing the sky in certain shots. I found that this is an easy way to tell the audience that this world is out of the ordinary. So the first technique I'm going to do is just manually painting the sky a different colour. This is probably the simplest technique, but I also believe it tends to not look as good as the others. The second one is going to be using keying to cut out the sky completely and then replacing it with a new image. So for example, this only works when the sky is one flat colour, say it's all grey, all blue, something like that. So this tends to be very dependent on the weather, so I might not be able to do this when it comes to shooting, but hopefully, fingers crossed, I'm able to do it. And then finally, the final version is essentially just taking an image from online and laying that over the top to replace the sky, while the sky is still there behind it. Now, as for my approach, I plan on making a very basic shot list for this short film and then filming it as soon as possible, because my priority right now is editing and making it look as good as possible, because in the end, that's what I'm marked on. Now, when I product test this, I'm going to make sure that it's people that fit into that student target audience, because it's not directed at anyone else, so their feedback wouldn't be as useful as people that fit into this target market. So, are there any questions?
Any from the floor? What do you think the biggest challenge facing you is going to be?
Well, I think the biggest challenge I'm going to have right now is making sure that the audience doesn't get confused about where the protagonist actually is, because I find that whenever you're messing with people travelling through what's essentially different places in space, teleporting basically, the audience can lose track of where they physically are. But in order to make sure that this doesn't happen, I'm going to make sure that the environments are very different. So for example, in the opening one where they're in their bedroom, the next shot I plan on having it outdoors in a field, so it really clearly shows that they're in a different space now.
Fantastic. And yeah, If the audience was to take one response from it, be that emotional, be that whatever, what audience reaction stroke response, what is it that you're actually looking for?
Well, I'm hoping that, because I do plan on having 1 or 2 visual gags in it, but that in the end that's not the core focus of the film, because I like the idea of at one point, after the chase scene I mentioned earlier, the protagonist jumps into this door, but the next dream they're in is the typical dream where the person's falling, and then the person would hit the ground, but they're fine, because then dreaming is not real. So I thought that can get a little gag out of it, but I want the general ending of it to be a bit more ambiguous, but I want the general message behind it to be, no matter how grim things might seem, as long as you keep pushing forward, eventually you'll get out of it.
I'm not sure if you mentioned it or not, but how come you decided to focus on editing more rather than the cinematography?
The reason I picked editing more is because I just prefer editing over cinematography, because when it comes to cinematography, you're stuck with the camera on set, so you can be limited in that regard, especially me, because I don't have any fancy equipment. So I find that editing, it just allows me to have a bit more creative freedom with it, because also this project in general has a lot of editing in it and not as much cinematography, because due to the editing, most of the shots will probably have to be static, because unless I can get a camera that can move automatically, it will be nigh impossible to sync up shots with clones in it or with portals in it.
How do you think this project is going to help you in the future?
Well, in the future, I'm hoping that I might be able to run a small group of filmmakers, kind of like what Corridor do on their own, just making short films and benefiting from it by making a small income from it online.